In this video, I'm going to develop some of the trains of thought that we outlined in the last one about the new economy. And in this video here, we're going to talk about platforms and the platformisation. Platforms are, in essence, the architecture of the network. So networks are constructed through platforms. And platformisation refers to the way that platforms are used and have become essential to the operation of society and, because of the nature of the course, of business more specifically. In the platforms and I think it's difficult to say that platforms have become more prevalent, because one of the arguments that we'll make here is that the idea of a platform is not a new concept. But what is new is what's become more apparent is the way in which the platform metaphor and the concept of the platform has been applied more readily to different things. Now, clearly, when we talk about platforms, I think we all know what we're talking about. We're talking about social media platforms like the Facebooks and so on and so forth. But I would ask you to consider more widely is that how many of the big tech firms are platforms, and how also banks can be seen as being platforms too. Now, the power of the platform is that once you're sort of incorporated into a platform, it's difficult to leave it. Now, that's not to say that you don't have agency, is that clearly you do. But if you still want to keep up with the network that you've developed within that platform, then using the platform is essential. So in that way, the platform holds on to you. And the platformisation, therefore, is about the importance of the platforms, how individuals use the platform, but from a business perspective is how the platform companies use the individuals who are members of their networks and operate on their own platform. Okay, so let's just take a brief hiatus out here as well, and because we need to think about business models and business model innovation. The concept of business modeling has gained an awful lot of attention in the last 15 to 20 years. More widespread use of the term corresponds to the widespread utilization of the internet, but it's more than just the utilization of the internet, because it's very much related to the utilization or how the internet is used, and that's used through platforms and through smartphones. And smartphones are usually use the internet through a platform in and of itself. So, the business modeling, internet, platforms are all very much sort of intertwined in a reciprocal sort of relationship. Now, definitions of platforms are not straightforward, because there's lots of them. Here we're defining a business model as the ability of the firm to achieve financial viability, cover its costs in other words, and satisfy its chief stakeholder concerns. Stakeholder concerns which are wider than shareholder concerns, which we've focused upon today. But in that, we'd need to think about who the stakeholders of any particular business are. A business model wouldn't deal with all of their concerns, which has important considerations for when we deal with things like corporate social responsibility and for environmental sustainability and governance frameworks, which we'll talk about towards the end of the programme. But it's who has the chief concern. The definitional thing is an issue as is described in that third paragraph. It's where you're looking at, say, perhaps a piece of art, and like art itself, it's one of those things that many people feel they can recognise when they see it, especially a particularly clever or a terrible piece of art, but you can't quite define it. Yeah, so that's the business model. We can see it, but it's very difficult to put it into words. And so I think our attempt here to put it into words in terms of it being about achievement of financial viability and matching the chief concerns of shareholders is as good as we're going to get, really. So now we're moving on to the platform economy. Now, interestingly, in this course, we've talked about lots of different kinds of economy. And one of the points that we're making is that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all economy. There are varieties of economies, there are varieties of capitalism, there are varieties of systems and business systems, and each economy, each example really needs to be treated on its own merits and looked at individually. Platforms are digital infrastructures that enable two or more groups to interact. So in that respect, platforms are intermediaries. Where have we heard that expression before? Customers, advertisers, service providers, producers and suppliers, and even physical objects are all able to engage within a platform. I think what's quite interesting though about the platform is that the platform provider sets up the architecture for people to act on. Now this has important consequences for, I don't know, let's say Facebook, as to say that we're only an intermediary, we're not responsible therefore for the content on it. And there's been a more of a gradual move towards the point where platforms are having to take positions on some of the information, the data or whatever it is that the platform's being used for. You can see why platforms would want to be absolved from a responsibility for the content or for what's being shared, but can they realistically, ethically, realistically do that and hoped to do that, or should they be responsible for whatever the content is that is being shared on their platform? Platforms in themselves, because of the nature of the intermediary relationship, are monopolies. You have to be in that platform in order to be able to experience the content. You can't exist outside of the platform and see that content. So in that respect, they are monopolies. But there are perhaps a number of different platforms that are doing a similar sort of thing, but they do tend to be dominated by big players. The monopoly is reliant upon the network effects, which harks back to Castell's concept of the digital economy. The more users, the more valuable the platform is. If the platform's only got 2 users, it's got very little value. If it's got 1.5 billion or a couple of a billion, then therefore the platform is very valuable, but is also a monopoly. And the platforms themselves embody politics in that the rules of product, service development and the interactions are set by the platform owner. So whatever is acceptable is set by whoever operates and owns the platform itself. And in that respect is that they embody their own politics and their own political framing. We should seriously ask questions about whether that is possible, or whether actually the political embodiment of the platforms is actually determining the shape of the information that's being shared and that's being searched for and being repatriated, repackaged and reshared. Platforms ownership is determined by their software, their source code and their hardware, servers, the data centers and the smartphones. In order to be able to access the platform, to be able to enjoy the benefits of being part and parcel of that platform community, is that you need to have the relevant software and the relevant kind of hardware. And actually the platform owners can determine the kind of software. Well, you have to have the right kind and the relevant kinds of software, but you also may need to have the right kind of hardware in order to be able to enjoy the platforms. I said earlier on is that platforms are not new, is that platform business models existed for a number of years before, and I've given you a couple of examples here, is that supermarkets act as platforms in that they bring together consumers and food producers, but the supermarket in of itself doesn't produce the food. Similarly, newspapers are in essence analog platforms, is that the platform, the newspaper, brings together journalists and readers, and also brings together readers with advertisers, more importantly. And so you can see that how the newspaper sits between advertising and advertisers and readers and consumers. ICT's computerization has reduced the need to own physical infrastructure and assets, which makes the platform business model much more available to for wider scope and more flexibility than the old models that I've talked about. And they still exist, but they're declining and they're being supplanted and taken over by much more high-tech and much more flexible platforms on ICT hardwares. So, as I said earlier on, is that platform businesses bring together producers and consumers in high-value exchanges. Chief assets are information and interactions. And again, you can see that there's quite considerable reference back to the idea of the information economy and the networked economy as expounded by Castells. So chief assets of these platforms is information and interaction, which together is also the source of the value that they create and is also their competitive advantage. And over a period of time, this has led to a change in the sort of rankings of the biggest businesses on the planet. And very quickly as well, is that in 2006, the world's largest firms were oil and gas, consolidated engineering firms. Microsoft's still up there, but Citigroup as well, banking, BP and Royal Dutch Shell, oil and gas, energy. Okay, so only one tech firm in there back in 2006. By 2016 is that Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft and Amazon supplanted the oil and gas conglomerates. And now, actually, if you were to consider more up-to-date information than this, is that Facebook would be in there as well, and that the largest businesses on the planet by market cap are tech businesses and tech platforms. The reason that I've used or I've still maintained the 2016 figures is that by 2016 or in 2016 is that Amazon, which was valued at 362 billion. It's quite remarkable to think that in the last 4 years is that the value of Amazon has gone from 362 billion up to over $2 trillion. But Amazon, get me Apples and me Amazons all mixed up. Apple, Amazon and Alphabet, too many A's. Is that in 2016, Amazon, despite the fact that it was worth 362 billion, wasn't demonstrating a profit. But it was still the fourth largest business by market cap, which is, and if you hark back to one of the newspaper articles that I gave you to look at in the critical thinking work materials, is that Amazon is using an example of a story stock. Very much is a story stock, as its value is being driven by expectations and by narratives. And we said earlier on is that the value of the platform is dependent upon the amount of users. Well, the biggest online platforms have a user base on par with the populations of the world's most populous countries. Facebook, this is from the same report, 2016. Facebook's user numbers will have increased considerably by that time, by now. But Facebook have got 1.5 billion users, whereas China had a population of 1.3 billion and India too. YouTube over 1 billion, WhatsApp over 1 billion, WeChat 660 million, but WeChat and Alibaba, Instagram would be dramatically larger than those numbers now, and will be dwarfing the populations of the United States and Indonesia and Brazil as the next most populous countries. So they're big, huge amount of people interacting on these platforms. And as a consequence of that, interactions and platforms produce this amount of data every 60 seconds, 980,000 tweets, 695,000 status updates, 11 million messages, 700,000 Google searches, 168 million plus emails, 1.82 terabytes of data created, and every 67's another 217 new mobile web users. That figure's out of date now. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to what new mobile numbers are going to get, because that's obviously going to be saturated by that particular point in time. And the point of showing these figures is just to show you the dramatic amount of data that's been created by platforms and platform businesses. And as a consequence of that, there is a commensurate intermediate or intermediating industry that's grown up as part of it, which is typified, I think, by Bell and Castell's conceptualizations of work and society, in that platforms produce a lot of data, but data mining companies and big data companies big data companies are incredibly influential because of the fact that they are mining and they are interpreting and they are using the data. Not surprisingly, therefore, the big data market has grown dramatically from 7.6 billion in 2011 to 56 billion in 2020, and likely to hit 103 billion by 2027. Personally, I think these estimates are quite conservative, but big business, but a nascent business as well. Maybe people think that big data is worth a lot more than it actually is currently, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not incredibly valuable. And this is just in the big data mining, the mining of the utilization of the data itself. It doesn't take into account the advertising spends. Advertising is a different market and it is calculated differently, apart from the big data businesses themselves. So data flows, as we can see, have got positive economic effects, and that's the kind of like the net learning that comes out of this, is that data and the production of data and the utilization of data and the analysis of data has an economic impact. Now, I think we need to think about this a little bit more widely, because an economic impact upon who, or an economic effect upon who and on whom? The data is about consumers. And what is the data trying to ascertain? Data in and of itself has got very little impact for consumers. We don't consume data. So it is the value of the data is in the impact that it has for the packaging of products and adverts for relevant consumers. But the theories behind data and the economy is that data flows support productivity improvement and increase capital and labour inputs. Data flows and digitization have raised net employment within countries rather than reducing it. Data flows enable innovation, remote work, and new types of economic activity that did not exist before. And I think that last point there about data flows enabling innovation in remote work and different types of activity that didn't exist before is demonstrably true, as being proven by the COVID-19 crisis, in that some firms, some businesses have seen their businesses grow dramatically during COVID. Additionally, people are finding ways of coping with COVID and are working at distance more distance than they were before. But not without some concerns, I think, and only it's a matter of time before we find out what those concerns are going to be. Data flows and digitization have raised net employment within countries. I'm not sure that I mean, that's an assertion of fact, but it would need to be proven. We'd need to dig into that. I don't think that you can just say that because net employment has increased, that is as a consequence of data flows and digitization. Net employment has increased, but into what? And into what kind of jobs and what kind of roles are people doing, and I think that that's still a question that's open for debate and for interpretation. And we'll talk about labour trends in another session. According to McKinsey, global flows account for approximately 10% of GDP output. I'll look at the figures on the right-hand side of the page there, and we can actually try and put some numbers against them. But goods and trade is $2.7 trillion worth annually. The migration, $1.5 trillion annually, and foreign direct investment, 1.3% annually. So whilst global flows might account for 10% of GDP output, is that its monetary value is about 7.8%. So accordingly, GDP at this particular point in time of these figures is about $78 trillion, which is about right in terms of my memory for what GDP was like in 2014. But I think what's interesting is that data flows are valued at $2.3 trillion, or 3% of global GDP, which is quite interesting. Because what does it tell us about the quality of the data? How do we know what kind of the quality of the data is? What does all of the data that is flowing around the world, what does it comprise of when the majority of the data is actually taken from platforms that are social media type platforms? So that will be an interesting point of difference to try and look at. But nevertheless, is that when people like McKinsey are claiming that data flows are important, remembering how narratives can perform the economy, is if McKinsey says that data flows are important, then you can bet your life that a majority of the, well, not a majority, but a considerable number of people that are involved in business will accept that narrative as being perfectly acceptable and will act accordingly. I think what's also interesting here is that traditional flows, goods, services, and finance have declined, and that includes the financial figures. But of course, the financial figures is completely congruent with what we've done before in terms of finance and financialization, because the finance that they're talking about here is specifically related to foreign direct investment. Okay, so traditional flows are declining, which is an interesting concept when you think about the sort of totalizing nature of globalization. But traditional flows are declining, and the big growth area is the one of data and data flows. Remembering, of course, is that Castell said that the network society is one that's typified by not a space of places, but a space of flows. But places benefit by being nodes of spaces of flows. And here is that these are the most significant cities on the planet for goods, services and people, financial, people more generally, and data and communication. And the classifications and what the various classifications mean between what's contained within them and not is not really very interesting. I think what's just interesting is what the global cities are. And if you go just have a look at that, is that London appears more frequently than any other city, which is a surprise to me, to be perfectly honest. But spaces of places and spaces of flows can combine together in geographical locations in order to increase the importance or the significance of a particular place, because it's a conduit of flows. And London is a conduit of people, goods and services because of the nature of the fact that it's got such a large population. Financial because of its city of London and the banking content. People, it's a desirable place to be. It's a nexus of not only immigration, but also of internal migrations, and it's a data and communication hub. This particular chart just shows you who's making money, how and where, and the amounts that are being made are quite astronomical. The slide is here, but it's purely descriptive. I mean, it just describes what each of these big tech firms does. You'd have to really work quite hard to try and find out exactly what they do because they're all very careful about the information that they share. But if you were to take some time out to just go through this yourself and to ask some questions about what is the nature of the business, is that you can see that much of it, if not a considerable proportion of it, is related to the generation, capture, and distribution of data flows, rather than selling goods and associated services. They are the outward face of what's being sold, but behind the sales, there is this quite considerable trade in data, which allows the valuation of the firms to go up as a consequence of the narratives of the economy, or the narratives, the economic narratives that support the data businesses, their positions as being tech and platform monopolies. And so I think that what we'll do is that we'll leave that one there with the sheer scale of the revenues that these 5 firms manage to generate each particular year. I'm not quite, how much would it be if you aggregated them all up? Two and a bit trillion dollars on an annual basis. Extraordinary performance. But the point I'm making here is that such revenues are developed out of the fact that they are monopoly platforms engaged in the generation, organization, structuring, and the distribution of data. And they're extraordinary in that basis. However, perhaps what you might want to consider is the parallels between these 5 and the banking industry, and consider them as huge multinational platform intermediaries, but dealing with finance and the data that is accumulated as a consequence of the finance. Consider how valuable that might be. And of course, the one thing that we've not considered here, and we really ought to, is to consider the platform businesses of China, because we haven't thought about WeChat and the parent companies of Alibaba and Tencent. And what's interesting to me is how some of these platforms have morphed into financial firms. Apple Pay, Google Pay, Alibaba Pay, I think that's right. I'm sure that somebody will correct me. And so my concluding remarks would be that there are more similarities between the tech platforms and the financial platforms, and that those similarities are converging over time.